land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.
Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to the 24th Right and Left Discussion Forum. Our purpose is to demonstrate that people with different political views can deal with contentious topics in a civilized manner. We believe that the progress of our communities and our nation hinges to a great degree on how much we care about and consider the opinions of others. We know that while beating down someone else's opinion may provide a certain primitive satisfaction, it does nothing to advance our common interest in effective self-government. Today our topic is our climate change policy driven by science or politics? And on our panel today, sitting on my left, is Patty Haskins, Democratic member of Wadsworth City Council. On her left is, I did this again, I wrote it in and he's not here. On his left is Bryan Laubaugh, president of R&B Financial Services. And on his left is Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist. And we're going to start off with Patty Haskins today. Patty, I'm putting you on the spot with a big one here today. Opinions about the causes of global warming or about climate change. Let's call it climate change. Right. They're clearly split between the left and the right. And even though the UN International Panel on Climate Change continually leans toward man-made CO2 from the burning of fossil fuels as the chief cause of global warming, many on the right insist that this is a politically driven opinion and that natural forces are more likely the cause. The question is there enough evidence that carbon dioxide from fossil fuels is the culprit to put in place very expensive steps?
There's a lot in that question that you're asking.
I know.
First of all, I think there are multiple causes. CO2 is obviously not the only cause. There's also the release of methane gas, the amount of water vapor. I read one comment that said, okay, water vapor can cause global warming. We're not going to do anything to cut down on our sources of water. But all of these work together to cause climate change. I think you first have to come to agreement that there is a problem with climate change at this point, because there are naysayers out there who contend that there is no such thing and we should just simply ignore this. I think overwhelmingly, though, the scientific opinion is that climate change does exist and it does have dangerous effects. For example, the rise in sea level, the severity of storms, and these are things that we're already seeing. The decrease in the polar pack and glaciers in Alaska and so forth, which are decreasing in size. And so that there are some effects which will have long-term consequences. So at that point, we then look at the causes of climate change or of global warming. And we try to see what we can deal with. Now, there are, again, naysayers who say there are no man-made causes of this. And granted, there are causes for which, because there have always been climate change, over thousands and thousands of years, mm-hmm. we have seen changes, whether it be from the Ice Age or whatever. But we have to look at those changes which we can control. And one of those changes is the CO2 emissions that we're presently seeing. And if we can do something to eradicate this, we look at, I looked up some figures that said that 40% of the CO2 emissions come from electric production. And of that electric production, 93% of that comes from burning coal. Now, does this mean that we're going to quit using electricity in this country? I doubt that's going to happen, and I would be a hypocrite if I were to say we need to eliminate all of that. Mm-hmm. However, there are ways to more efficiently, perhaps, produce electricity than perhaps by the burning of coal. We look at 33% of the emissions of CO2 come from the burning of gasoline for cars. Now, once again, we're not going to quit driving their car, and particularly mm-hmm. in a community where we are, where Mass transit is not available in the amounts that we would like to see. All of us drive a car, but we can look at more fuel-efficient cars and ways to more efficiently use that. I think when you suggest that it is political, I do believe that this issue does fall on political lines, whereas liberals tend to be more in favor of making changes in the CO2 emissions, in the methane emissions, in all of the things that, the deforestation, which can cause an increase in the amount of CO2 in the land. And conservatives are saying not to do this. I have concerns with that because some of the reports that I have read, because I looked at all different types of websites, those that are purporting this as a myth and those that are saying it as a fact, and a lot are saying, listen, this is not a problem we can control, this is the natural order of the globe, and just let it go because we can't control what's going to happen 3 generations down. Yet that always seems to be an argument, when we talk about the debt ceiling, we always say we have to protect our children and our grandchildren and their children. And I think that this is an issue that we have to do as well. The fact that different political entities fall in certain camps, though, I think has more to do with an economic background than it does with a political background. If you are from a state where coal is a big industry, you are not going to want to see, as a political from that state, you're not going to want to see a reduction in the amount of coal produced.
This is like Ron's cousin, right?
Yeah. Who is going to see a strong economic impact on their area if there is a reduction in the amount of coal produced.
Sure.
That politician will not get reelected if he does that. If you are an area where oil is a big industry, or if one of your top donors happens to be one of the oil companies, they are obviously going to push for the other side of this. Interestingly enough, most of the articles that I read on why global warming was a myth were written by economists, not by scientists. So what they're thinking, my idea is that what they are thinking in the back of their heads, if this is more of an economic issue, you mentioned in your opening that should we spend all of this money for this? I think it's important that we do at least spend the money on the research to come up with economical ways to reduce the carbon footprint that we're erasing, to cut down on those CO2 emissions so that we can leave this planet in a better place for our future generations to come.
Yeah. What I hear you saying is that you're giving this the political side that the providers of electric power and the miners and so forth, they're having their own political influence because they want to protect their economies.
Right.
Bryan, what about the other side? What about the side that insists that man-made CO2 is causing great harm? They have a political agenda too, don't they?
Yeah, I think they do, and Patty has sort of outlined that. The problem that I've had is that the left, when they run this global warming, CO2 emissions, the whole climate change argument up the flagpole, they always fall back to the human impact on the earth. And some of the extremists, some of the articles that I read, their only solution is there needs to be less humans. There needs to be less of us.
That was scary.
Yeah. So, I believe in moderation, conservation. We need to be good stewards of the resources that we have. But when you look at the situation and the environmental extremists want to basically tie our hands behind our back, you can't use coal. Everybody hates nuclear. There aren't enough wind farms to generate the electricity. Now, the wind farms don't take into account the bats that fly into those windmills and the birds that get taken out by those windmills. And nobody wants a wind farm in their backyard, especially the Kennedys off of Hyannisport, because the wind blows there consistently, and it'd be a great place to put in about 100 windmills, but they don't want that. I take exception to what I would consider the limousine liberals. What happened to Mr. Gore? Where'd he go to? You know, the author of the Inconvenient Truth movie, you know, he took his several $100 million that he got from Qatar, which is one of the leading producers of oil, which, you know, from a principled standpoint, I would think that he would cringe if he was going to sell his interest in his TV station to these people. But see, that doesn't fit. They want to basically tax and hamstring everybody else but them because they can afford the carbon credits. They can afford to buy the carbon credits to basically reduce their carbon footprint. So it gets into what I consider kind of that Joe and the volcano scenario where you just kind of start wondering what, you know, I believe there probably is some global warming and global cooling. There are things that we can do as good stewards to help our planet, but I'm just not, you know, so far down the road that we can't do anything to appease the environmental extremists. You wouldn't be driving your Prius; you'd be walking. You know, you know what I'm saying? Or bicycling. You know, I just don't see. And I think cooler heads can prevail, and we can all come to an agreement that there are things we can do that won't bankrupt. You know, industry won't bankrupt societies, communities. You know, there are a lot of things that can be done with coal, clean coal, low sulfur, all that kind of stuff. I'll leave all that up to our resident PhD here about that. But I just think it's, you know, the extremists have taken over this issue, and if you don't do it their way, then there's nothing that you can possibly do to solve the problem. You know?
On both sides.
Yeah,
we got
yeah.
extremists.
Ron, you and I met and had a conversation about this some time back, and as I recall, in that conversation, I did all the talking and you did all the smiling like you're doing right now. So now is my opportunity to put you on the spot.
All right. Let me back up just a little bit. I've heard some interesting things here and some good things that I agree on both sides. And there are good arguments for and against what is happening and what we ought to do about it. Let me back up just a second. I have a graphic I retrieved here. I don't know that the actual camera could pick that up, but this depicts a chart back to 400,000 years before the present, sea level, temperature, and CO2. And you can see that they follow roughly pretty much the same trend here. Now, these data are gathered from sea level sediments, from lake shores, from glacial advances and plant fossils, all that.
Don't wiggle that because he's in on you.
Can we get it?
Yeah.
The
Very
bottom
good.
line there is sea level, which I've sketched in black because it wasn't showing up too well. The middle is temperature, and the top is CO2. Now, one couple of interesting things about this. Let me take this down for a second. The natural CO2 peaks in that period of time have been 280 parts per million. Now, John, you and I talked about this being trace amounts. Yes, but the techniques for measuring this are well established. Gas chromatography, spectroscopy. We find this stuff in stars and on other planets by spectroscopy. Present CO2 levels, and this was about 2009 that this graphic came out of, 385 parts per million.
Parts per million?
385 parts per million.
Parts per million of what? The
Parts per million of the
greenhouse?
atmosphere. Of the atmosphere.
The total atmosphere.
Total
Okay,
atmosphere.
not just the greenhouse gases.
No.
Okay.
Total atmosphere. That's a fairly large increase, and sea levels and temperature levels are going
Would you
along with
repeat
it.
those two numbers?
280 parts per million historically back to 400,000 years before the present.
280.
The present time, 385 parts per
Okay.
million. Now, as I look at this graph carefully, I see sea level, temperature precede a little bit CO2 peaks. And that puzzled me for a few minutes. I realized there's a plausible scenario here. You set your beer out on the table and it warms up, and the carbon dioxide comes out of it. As the Earth begins to heat for whatever reason, the Earth precessing on its orbit, more or less sunlight, the oceans heats up, the warmer they get, less CO2 it holds, more CO2 comes into the atmosphere, more greenhouse effect occurs, the sea heats up a little further. It's a positive feedback loop.
Mm-hmm.
All right, present levels aren't explained by that.
Mm-hmm.
400,000 years is a long time to collect data. And you might argue about the limits of accuracy of this and where it comes, but...
Especially 400,000 years ago. I imagine they were kind of primitive in their temperature gathering.
Well, as I say, it comes from basically fossil information, and the analyses are quite accurate. So there's that. There's that. There's some doubt in the actual science of what's happening. Certainly the observations, as Patty pointed out, the global warming is happening. And also within this, as you might notice, up and down, Bryan, you have an article here that says, to the horror of global warming alarmists, global cooling is here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's warming and cooling both within these aspects on the shorter term. Up and down.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I just read last week where the Institute for Ice and Snow, it's a part of the EPA, I think, and they had announced that in 2010, the coldest temperature in the history of the planet, or been able to measure, was recorded in Antarctica at minus 138 degrees Fahrenheit. The previous record was like 10 degrees lower than that, or warmer than that. And that I was amazed, and then I was even more amazed to find out that this year it almost topped that for the coldest ever. Mm-hmm. You know, and
I think it's not just warming though. When we talk about climate change, unfortunately what you see are the extremes in both.
Yeah, I was thinking this morning on the way here, where's global warming when you need some?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's cold out.
But I mean, it's
I'm right there with
over
you.
the last. Well, you know, I think the temperature, or average temperature, has increased 1.4 degrees since 1880, which doesn't sound like much, but what they've found in the last couple of decades is that the rate at which the average temperature, which takes into account those extreme colds and extreme warms, is increasing at a much faster rate. Mm-hmm. And that is what is of more concern than the fact that it's just going up, that it's increasing at a faster rate. So,
which brings me around to a point of view that I'm really concerned about, and that's how the media handles all of this, and how people report it. Temperature data is gathered from simply thermometers that are placed strategically around the globe. It's also gathered from ice cores. It's also gathered from satellites. And sometimes I'm afraid I'm a real cynic when it comes to what point are you trying to make, and what data are you using?
When you start your measurement for your trend.
Well, that's a good one. If you start at the end of the cold spell, you know, a cold, like 1972, if you're starting then, and I can tell you it was cold in 1972 because I was still in Akron U, and the wind blows down through that campus like you can't imagine at night.
I remember.
But you know, my point is though that we get manipulated by data. The data that you're giving is a little bit different than what the official temperature gathering department, if you will, for the United States government. It's the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy does some, and the Environmental Protection Agency does some. But the Department of Energy does a composite of the satellites, ice core, the temperature things, and they're recording a little bit different than you. Well, you were giving Fahrenheit, and I don't know how to.
Yeah, it was different in centigrade. It was like point something centigrade. It would be less.
Yeah, but they're saying that since the current global warming trend has gone on for the last 143.8 years, the mean temperature has increased by 0.74 degrees centigrade.
That's pretty close.
Is
Correct.
it?
That's
Yeah,
about-
that's
about
pretty
it.
close. And this information came from the Goddard Space Institute with NASA. I had a lot of, many times if I'm giving an amount, I look at who is quoting that figure, because it could be Joe Smith down in the corner.
Yeah.
You know, so we want to make sure that it's.
I mentioned my sister and her farm down in Cambridge. It's a Christmas tree farm. And I was talking to her the other day, and she said that in some 30 years of having this Christmas tree farm, this is the first year that they've had snow on the ground before they were done selling Christmas trees.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which I thought was which doesn't mean anything. Weather is different than climate and so forth. But there's an example I wanted to use in my concern about how things get reported and how media responds. And I'm not picking on media. Media has us for a customer. And as a customer, we like conflict and we like fear. You know, so then that's what they're selling us, because that's what we're willing to buy. But just an example, the president a few weeks ago was talking about global warming as being one of his key agenda items for the remainder of his term, and that the reason that he gave is that 97% of the world's scientists, not climatologists, 97% of the world's scientists have reported that they agree that global warming is caused by anthropogenic CO2, or man-made CO2. Now, here's the interesting thing. I heard that from several other places. I heard it on the media, that 97% of the world's scientists agree. So I tried to find out where they got that number. And they got it from a study that was done headed up by a man by the name of John Cook at the University of Queensland, Australia. He and 9 others, scientists from the United States and Canada, had conducted a survey. What they did was to look at 11,944 papers that were written about climate change. I'm going to say that's almost 12,000 papers. They went through them. And what they were looking for is scientists, what opinion they, excuse me, I'm saying that all wrong. Do they agree with the International Panel on Climate Change consensus that it is a certainty now that climate change is caused by anthropogenic CO2? And of the 11,944 papers, 66.4% did not take a stand one way or the other. They did not. 32.6% took a position on whether or not global warming was caused by man-made CO2. Of the 32.6%, 97.1% agreed with the consensus that it was caused by. This is not 97% of the world scientists. It's 97% of the 32% of the 11,944 that they surveyed.
You know,
and when you put stuff out, I mean, that's what people want to hear.
Figures
Mark
are
Twain
always
said there are
confusing.
lies, there are damned lies, and there are statistics.
Statistics, I mean, I
It's hard
talk
to say
It's
that.
hard to-
97% of scientists.
But even that way, if you were to ask me, is it caused by this, I might say I'm not going to take an opinion, because there is more than one cause. It's not just CO2. So a lot of times it also, when you're doing statistical
people
data, how the
discounting
question is phrased.
Discounting also methane. You know, all humans generate
Exactly.
methane. And imagine
Cows.
the amount of methane that's produced by cows chewing their cud to supply meat for hamburgers for McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's.
See, and now we're going to get into one of those extreme opinions that we shouldn't be eating meat.
You know, I don't even think we're going there. It's just methane is one of the causes, which I mentioned earlier.
One of the things I'm concerned about is that we're going to charge full ahead doing foolish things like corn ethanol. And
Yeah.
even Al Gore apologized for ever supporting corn ethanol, because he knows, A, it does not have any positive impact on CO2 by the time you take the CO2 produced during the processing of the stuff and all of that. And the negative part is, during the growing season, all of the pesticides and fertilizers, the people out in Iowa and so were put on the ground, go down the Mississippi River, and they've hugely expanded this huge dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, we're still doing it, and across party lines. It was a Republican president that established a mandate that we have corn ethanol in our fuel, and then upped it twice. Pure political maneuver. If you want to get elected in Iowa, you support it. Yeah.
And that's the economics background too, yeah.
And there was one other thing that my old mind is, I was going to make another really heavy-duty point here. Let's see, I was talking about corn ethanol and, well, that's
one of the things though, I mean, I think we admit that it does exist, but I don't want to be in a position where we just throw our hands in the air and say, okay, we can't do anything about it.
Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to mention one other stupid thing. Down in Brazil, the country of Brazil is very, very aggressive when it comes to cutting down on CO2. So in order to do that, they increased production of beets to make biofuels out of beets. In order to do that, they had to tear down the rainforest, which absorbs CO2.
Well, which, exactly. That's the deforestation, yes.
Yes, but I'm just concerned about the foolishness that people are going to salute anything that sounds like it might be a solution like corn ethanol. And even after we know that it's harmful, we're continuing with corn ethanol mandates. But anyway.
I would just simply like to see the naysayers that do not want to even admit that there's even a possibility that there's a problem come to terms with that.
I wish people would understand there's a huge difference between climate change that is man-made, and climate change that is natural. We're not. But anyway, I got to move ahead here. And I wanted to thank you. That was a good discussion. I'm sorry, I got a little bit more animated in that one than I wanted to.
You're the moderator. Okay,
well, I had two quotes here, but I'm only going to give you one from Thomas Sewell. Would you bet your paycheck on a weather forecast for tomorrow? If not, why should this country bet billions on global warming predictions that have even less of a foundation? I had one from Michael Moore, but you're not going to hear that right now. Thank you very much.